The clock had no second hand. Or maybe it did, and nobody wanted to look closely enough to see it moving. In the corridor, the light was the color of watered milk, thin and tired, making every surface look as if it had been wiped clean too many times. A man in a gray shirt stood with his back to the wall, hands folded at his belt, shifting his weight from heel to heel with a patience he'd practiced so long it had stopped being a choice. Across from him, a door with peeling paint stayed shut. The air around it carried the faint smell of oil and damp wool, as though something heavy had been stored in there and never properly aired out. From somewhere deeper in the building came the slow, regular click of a typewriter. One line, a pause, another line, a pause, like someone trying not to be heard. Then the softer sound of paper being stacked and squared, edges tapped against a desk. A match flared and went out. A chair creaked. A cough was swallowed before it could become a statement. No one spoke in the hallway. Not because it was forbidden, exactly, but because speech had started to feel like moving furniture in a room where the walls were already narrowing. When the silence grew too solid, someone adjusted a collar. Someone rubbed a thumb along the seam of a sleeve. Someone exhaled through the nose, slow enough to pretend it was nothing. A young runner, barely old enough to have learned how to stand still without fidgeting, walked past with a pouch tucked under his arm. He didn't hurry. That was the strange part. He moved at the same deliberate pace as the others, as if speed might invite attention from the wrong direction. His boots made a dull rhythm on the floorboards. Heel, toe, heel, toe. Then nothing when he reached the stairwell and disappeared. A telephone rang once somewhere far away. Not twice. Just a single ring that cut cleanly through the building and then stopped, leaving the echo behind like a finger lifted from glass. A moment later the typewriter resumed, but slower now, each keystroke separated by a longer breath. The man against the wall glanced at his wristwatch. He did it the way a person checks the sky when they already know the weather. The face of the watch reflected the corridor light and gave him nothing useful back. He turned his wrist away and stared at the door again. A handprint was visible on the wood, old, darkened by years, pressed into the grain where countless palms had leaned while waiting. A brass plate sat crooked near the frame, its letters worn smooth enough to be unreadable. Whatever it once announced had been touched too often by people who needed it to mean something. Farther down the corridor, a clerk crossed from one office to another carrying a metal tray with 2 cups. The cups clinked softly, a small domestic sound that didn't belong. The smell of coffee drifted for a moment, burnt thin, rationed, then vanished as the clerk passed through another doorway and pulled it shut behind him with care. Someone laughed briefly inside one of the rooms. A short laugh, too controlled, like a valve released for a second and then tightened again. It ended abruptly, replaced by a voice lowering into seriousness. The words couldn't be made out, only the shape of them. Questions asked too politely, answers delivered in halves. In the corridor, time became a series of repeated actions, a loop made of small tasks that kept hands busy, and minds from focusing on the single fact no one dared to name. A man paced 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, never crossing the same floorboard twice. He stopped and smoothed his hair with the heel of his palm, pressing it down as if it might rise and betray him. Another man rubbed at a stain on his trouser leg that had long since become part of the fabric. A woman at the far end of the hall, only her profile visible through a crack in a door, turned pages in a ledger with the methodical calm of someone keeping the world intact by counting it. Outside, something heavy moved along the street. The sound came through the walls as a low vibration, wheels over cobblestone, then the faint metallic groan of a vehicle stopping. No shout followed it, no hurry, just the sense of a presence settling into place. The door in front of the waiting man remained shut. He could hear breathing on the other side of it. Not clearly, not like words, but a pattern, inhale, pause, exhale, shared by more than one person in a space too small for comfort. He imagined a table, a lamp, hands resting on paper. He imagined the careful way fingers would hold a pen, not writing yet, only holding it like a promise. He reached into his pocket and found a folded slip of paper, creased and softened by being opened too many times. He didn't unfold it. He only pressed it between his fingertips, feeling the edge, reminding himself it was there. Then he put it back, as if touching it too much might make it real. A faint whistle rose from the pipes, a tired sound that wandered through the building and faded. Then, for a moment, everything lined up. The typewriter fell silent. The distant voices stopped. Even the corridor seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire place had leaned forward to listen for something. A footstep approached from the stairwell. Not quick, not slow. Measured. The waiting man straightened. His hands dropped to his sides. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed into a neutral expression he had worn so often it felt like his real face. The footsteps came closer, and with them the soft rustle of fabric and the faint jingle of keys. The lock on the door did not turn, but the man in the corridor knew, without being told, that there were fewer minutes left than anyone was admitting. A little later, how much later depended on whose watch you trusted, the corridor regained its ordinary sounds, but they returned changed, as if each one had been handled too many times. A pen scratched somewhere behind a closed door, not writing so much as testing ink. Someone tore a strip of paper from a pad with careful restraint, making the rip sound smaller than it should have been. The typewriter started again, but now it was a different rhythm, less like a clerk finishing routine work and more like a man counting steps in the dark. At the end of the hall, a window with wire mesh showed a slice of sky the color of dirty tin. The weather did not announce itself. It simply existed. Low clouds, no sun, a thin wind that pressed against the glass and made the frame tick with temperature. On the street below, boots moved in groups, not running, just shifting into place, the way furniture gets rearranged without anyone asking if the room still feels like home. The building was a staff headquarters, though no sign outside used those words. It sat in a town that had been stripped of its own voice. There were banners and regulations, posted notices, official schedules, layers of paper attempting to convince everyone that order still held. The walls inside were lined with maps and filing cabinets, and the stairwell smelled permanently of wet coats. The war had been present here for years in ink and stamp marks, in requisition forms and casualty reports, in the tense politeness of men who only spoke freely when they were certain the door was shut. In the mess room on the lower floor, a pot of coffee had been boiled until it turned bitter and thin. Men drank it anyway, cupping their hands around the enamel mugs for warmth. There was bread, sliced too thick to make it last longer, and a small dish of margarine scraped nearly empty. A cook, older than the uniforms around him, kept wiping the same counter with the same rag, as if cleanliness were a kind of defense. "Same as yesterday," someone muttered, not as a complaint but as a ritual phrase meant to steady the day. Someone else answered, "If it stays the same, we'll be lucky." They said it lightly. They tried to make it sound like humor. A radio sat on a shelf above the sink. Its casing was scuffed, the dial marked in pencil where the best reception could be found. A signal came through in bursts, clipped and faint, each transmission preceded by static that sounded like distant rain. The men listened the way people listen to a clock in a sick room, pretending it was background noise while measuring their own breathing against it. Outside, the town carried on with the same stubborn choreography it had adopted long ago. A tram bell rang at the corner, then rang again when the driver realized no one was moving fast enough to justify impatience. A woman in a scarf walked past the building with a basket and did not look up at the windows. A bicycle leaned against a wall, chained as if anyone imagined theft was still a primary concern. Somewhere, a dog barked once and stopped, as if corrected. Inside, desks were occupied, papers were filed, stamps hit ink pads and left blue marks on documents that would travel elsewhere and become orders. A clerk sharpened a pencil, rotating it slowly in a small metal sharpener, pausing to tap the shavings into a waste bin. The small acts of administration continued because they had to. Because if they stopped, the building would be forced to admit what everyone already felt, that there was a difference between normal work and the work of holding a crumbling edge together. On the second floor, in an office with 2 lamps and a portrait on the wall, a senior staff officer stood over a map table. The map was pinned down at the corners with brass weights. Along the edge, black pencils lay lined up, tips already blunted from use. A set of dividers rested open like a metal insect. The officer's hands hovered over the paper without touching it for a long moment, as if contact itself would confirm a decision. Across from him sat a younger lieutenant with a folder open on his knees. He kept his back straight, shoulders squared. The posture of someone still believing posture could influence outcomes. His eyes moved from the officer's face to the map and back, trying to predict which piece of information would be requested next. He did not speak unless spoken to. At a nearby desk, a civilian specialist, brought in for a matter that was supposedly technical and therefore neutral, checked figures on a pad. He wrote carefully, each number placed with precision. Once he cleared his throat as if to say something, then returned to his calculations without raising his head. On a chair by the wall, someone's coat hung like a person waiting. Its pockets bulged with gloves and folded notes. The coat's dampness marked a darker outline on the fabric of the chair, a reminder of the cold outside, of the world beyond the lamps and paper. The building's routines had adapted to wartime the way a body adapts to long illness. The fever becomes familiar. The fatigue becomes background. Men had learned to eat quickly without appearing hungry, to sleep lightly without admitting exhaustion, to accept sudden changes of schedule as if those changes had been planned all along. A runner came in from the street and shook rain from his cap before he remembered to remove it. He corrected himself. He handed a message to a clerk, who read it without changing expression, and then carried it upstairs with measured steps, as if rushing might turn the words into something worse. The message made its way through hands that touched paper like it was fragile. It was read, folded, placed on a desk. No one tore it up. No one crumpled it. It was treated with the solemn respect of something official, and therefore safe. In the corridor again, men continued to wait. Waiting had become its own occupation. They waited for a call, for a dispatch, for the door to open, for permission to stop pretending the day was ordinary. A small pocket watch was passed from one hand to another, an absent-minded gesture, almost intimate. One man opened it and snapped it shut without looking at the time. The click sounded louder than it should have in the corridor. "Any news?" a sergeant asked softly, not addressing anyone in particular. A clerk shook his head. Nothing new. The word nothing hung there. It was meant to comfort. It did not. In the communications room, operators sat with headphones pressed to their ears, their faces drained by concentration. Their fingers hovered over switches and keys. On the wall, a chart listed call signs and frequencies. Someone had drawn a small line through one of the call signs in pencil, and beside it, another had been written, as if identity could be changed to avoid consequence. A young operator, cheeks still full, hair cut too short, took off his headphones and rubbed his ear as though it ached from listening too hard. "Static," he said. "Static means weather," an older operator replied automatically. "Or distance," another said, his voice flat. They returned to listening. In a side room that served as a makeshift medical station, a medic inventoried bandages with bored efficiency. He counted rolls, then counted them again, like a man checking that the world still had the same number of fragile things. A stretcher leaned against the wall, unused. The medic avoided looking at it directly. Downstairs, the cook poured more hot water into the coffee pot. He did it carefully, watching the dark liquid rise as if it could spill into something irreversible. He tasted it, grimaced, and served it anyway. In the office with the map, the senior officer finally touched the paper. His finger traced a line, slow, deliberate, then stopped at a point that was just a dot of ink. He left his finger there, holding it like a seal. "Traffic is delayed," the lieutenant offered, as if delay were a solution and not simply a condition of life. The officer did not answer right away. He stared at the dot as though he could will it to move. A telephone on the desk sat silent. Its receiver was cradled properly. The cord lay coiled like a sleeping animal. Everyone kept glancing at it, then looking away, as if it might sense their attention and punish them by ringing. Someone outside the office laughed again, shorter this time, sharper, a laugh that ended in a cough. The sound traveled down the corridor and dissolved into the building's stale air. On the street, the low vibration returned, vehicles settling, engines idling, metal shifting under weight. It was not frantic. It was organized. That was what made it worse. The sound carried the confidence of something already arranged. At midday, a bell rang from a nearby church, muted by the clouds. It struck once, then again, each note stretched out and swallowed by the town. The people inside the headquarters did not pause for it. They had stopped orienting themselves to civilian time. Their time was measured in messages, in permissions, in the opening and closing of doors. A clerk brought up a tray with cups, and the smell of coffee drifted through the corridor again. Men accepted the cups with quiet gratitude, warming their hands on them. For a few minutes, they looked almost normal. Men drinking coffee in a hallway, waiting for a meeting, waiting for paperwork. One of them said, "We'll get through the afternoon." It was a simple sentence. It sounded like hope. No one contradicted him. No one agreed too strongly. They let it sit in the air like a small, fragile object that might break if touched. And somewhere in the building, a clock continued marking minutes without a second hand, while outside, the town kept rearranging itself into a shape that would soon make waiting impossible. The first thing to change was not a sound, but a pattern. An operator noticed it when he reached to log a transmission and hesitated, pen hovering just above the paper. The signal had come through cleanly enough. No distortion, no frantic repetition, but it had arrived at the wrong moment, between scheduled windows. He checked the wall chart, then the clock mounted above the door. The discrepancy was small, barely worth mentioning. He wrote the time down anyway, adjusting the numbers slightly, smoothing the inconsistency into something acceptable. Across the room, another operator leaned back in his chair and rolled his shoulders, trying to ease the tension that came from listening too hard. His headphones slipped for a second, and through the open air he heard a voice from the receiver, calm, unhurried, giving information that sounded ordinary enough to belong to any other day. He repositioned the headphones and focused again, the brief break already fading from memory. In the corridor outside, a pair of officers passed each other and exchanged nods without stopping. One of them slowed as if to speak, then decided against it. He adjusted his cap instead. The other continued on, his boots striking the floor in a rhythm that was slightly faster than it had been an hour earlier. A clerk sorting files paused at a drawer that refused to open smoothly. He tugged, frowned, tugged again. When it finally slid free, the metal rails shrieked briefly before settling. The sound lingered longer than expected. The clerk glanced around, embarrassed, then returned to his work with exaggerated care, as if gentleness might undo the noise. In the map room, the senior officer had shifted positions. He now stood with both hands braced on the table, leaning forward. The dot of ink he'd touched earlier had been circled lightly in pencil, a faint halo added without ceremony. The lieutenant noticed it and looked away, as though the addition of the circle were something private. The civilian specialist finished a column of figures and drew a line beneath them. He tapped the pencil once against the pad, considering. "There's a variance," he said at last, his voice measured, almost apologetic. The officer did not ask where. "It's small," the specialist continued, already softening the statement. "Within tolerance." The officer nodded. The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because continuing it would require acknowledging the implication behind the word variance. In another office, a telephone rang twice and was answered on the second ring. The man who picked it up listened without interrupting, his face a careful blank. When he finally spoke, his reply was brief and polite. He replaced the receiver gently, aligning it with the cradle as though precision mattered. "What was it?" someone asked from across the room. "Routine," he said. The word did its work. Chairs creaked as men shifted back into their tasks. Papers resumed their soft movement. The room accepted the explanation because it needed to. Outside, the weather pressed closer. The clouds hung lower now, flattening the light until the windows looked like dull mirrors. The wind picked up just enough to rattle a loose sign across the street, the metal clacking in a steady, irritating rhythm. No one inside commented on it. After weeks of disrupted nights, minor disturbances had become background. In the mess room, the cook noticed that the bread supply was lower than it should have been for the time of day. He counted the slices again, frowning. Someone must have taken extra. He shrugged and cut the remaining loaf thinner, adjusting portions without remark. Two men at the table spoke quietly about a card game they'd played the night before. One accused the other of cheating, not seriously. They both smiled, the exchange familiar and safe. The conversation drifted to the quality of the tobacco ration, then to nothing at all. A runner came in with a new message. This one was sealed differently, the wax pressed thinner, the stamp slightly off-center. The runner handed it over, waited for acknowledgement, and left without being told to hurry. His face showed no urgency. He had learned that speed was only noticed when it was missing. The message was read, then reread. It contained no alarming language, no explicit warning. It spoke of adjustments, of coordination, of expected developments. Someone underlined a phrase in pencil, then erased the line halfway through, leaving a faint smudge. In the communications room, the static grew heavier. Signals arrived with longer gaps between them. When they did come through, they were complete, well-structured. That was what made the operators uneasy, though none of them said so. In war, silence often arrived before chaos, not after. Could be atmospheric, the young operator offered. Could be, the older one agreed. They adjusted the frequency anyway. A minor correction meant to reassure themselves they were doing something. Down the hall, a door that was usually kept closed stood open an inch. Inside, a man sat alone at a desk, staring at a document he had memorized days ago. He did not read it. He simply looked at it, as if the paper might change if he watched long enough. When footsteps approached, he closed the folder quickly, the sound sharp in the quiet. A sergeant passed by carrying a clipboard. He stopped outside the open door, glanced in, and raised an eyebrow. The man inside nodded once, and the sergeant moved on without a word exchanged. The building had begun to exhibit small hesitations. Conversations paused an extra second before resuming. Men checked watches more often, then seemed dissatisfied with the information. Tasks were completed, but with a subtle delay, as if everyone were moving through water without admitting it. In the map room, the officer traced the penciled circle again, then added a second, larger one around it. He did not announce the action. The lieutenant noticed anyway. His fingers tightened briefly around the folder on his knees. "Supply reports are consistent," the lieutenant said, offering another piece of reassurance. "Good," the officer replied, though his eyes remained on the map. Somewhere in the building, a file cabinet slammed shut harder than intended. A voice muttered an apology. Laughter followed, too loud, then faded quickly. Outside, the vibration returned. Closer now. Engines idled longer than before. Metal clanked. The sound had acquired a density, a weight that pressed against the walls rather than passing through them. Inside, men continued to ignore the signs, not out of stupidity or cruelty, but because acknowledging them would require a different kind of attention, one that could not be withdrawn once given. A clerk carrying papers stopped mid-step, uncertain which office to enter. He chose one at random and knocked, waiting longer than usual before being told to come in. Time stretched, not snapping yet, but thinning, and with each small irregularity absorbed and dismissed, the space for correction narrowed, quietly, invisibly, while the day continued pretending it was still under control. The afternoon did not arrive all at once. It edged in minute by minute, pressing gently against the morning until the distinction between them blurred. Light shifted in the windows, flattening further, losing what little depth it had. Lamps were switched on without comment, one by one, their yellow circles overlapping on desks and tables. Shadows shortened, then pooled in corners where no one looked for them anymore. The building adjusted its posture, settling into the long hours when decisions were expected but not yet made. In the map room, chairs had been pulled closer to the table, not for a meeting, no one called it that, but because standing had begun to feel unnecessary, even wasteful. The senior officer sat now, jacket unbuttoned, cap set aside. He rolled his shoulders once, slowly, as if loosening a knot that had been tightening all day. The lieutenant had moved from the chair by the wall to one beside the table. The folder still rested on his knees, unopened. He had memorized its contents earlier and saw no reason to look again. Looking would only confirm what he already knew. The civilian specialist stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the wire mesh as if it might reveal something beyond the clouds. He had stopped writing. His pad lay abandoned on a side desk, the pencil placed neatly across it, aligned with the edge. No one spoke for a while. The silence was not awkward. It was functional. From the corridor came the sound of footsteps approaching, then stopping just outside the door. A pause. A hand knocked. Once, lightly. The knock was answered with a word, not loud enough to travel far. The door opened and a junior officer stepped in, carrying a thin envelope. He held it out. The senior officer accepted it without hurry. The envelope was opened carefully. The paper slid out and unfolded. The officer read it once, then again. He did not pass it around. He did not comment. He folded it back along the same creases and placed it on the table beside the map, weighted with a brass paperweight to keep it from curling. The junior officer remained standing, waiting for instruction. "Thank you," the senior officer said at last. The junior officer hesitated, as if expecting more, then nodded and left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. The lieutenant watched the envelope for a moment, then looked away. He adjusted his position in the chair, trying to sit more comfortably. It did not help. In the communications room, operators had stopped pretending the static was harmless. They still used the word atmospheric, but it was said with less conviction. One operator removed his headphones and rubbed his temples. "There's a gap," he said quietly. "How long?" someone asked. The operator checked the log. "Longer than it should be." No one suggested escalating the issue. They all knew escalation required certainty, and certainty was precisely what they lacked. A clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated patience. Each second landed heavily, as though time itself were testing how much pressure the room could tolerate. In the corridor, waiting had changed character. Men no longer leaned casually against the walls. They stood straighter now, closer together, hands no longer fidgeting. Conversations had dwindled to murmurs, then stopped entirely. Everyone seemed to be listening for something specific, though no one could say what it was. A sergeant checked a list on his clipboard and made a small mark next to a name. He hesitated before making the next mark, then did it anyway. The list was folded and tucked under his arm. Downstairs, the cook began cleaning early. He stacked mugs, wiped the counter again, rinsed the pot even though it would be needed later. He moved with the efficiency of someone who preferred activity to thought. Outside, the town grew quieter. Shops closed their shutters earlier than usual. Windows were darkened. The street's usual rhythm softened, replaced by a waiting that mirrored the one inside the building. Vehicles remained in place longer, engines idling, drivers leaning forward over their wheels, eyes fixed ahead. Back in the map room, the senior officer picked up one of the pencils and rolled it between his fingers. He did not write. He simply held it, feeling its weight, its potential. "There's still time," the lieutenant said suddenly. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He regretted them immediately, not because they were wrong, but because saying them out loud made them fragile. The senior officer did not react. He continued rolling the pencil, eyes on the map. "Yes," he said after a moment. "There is." He did not elaborate. The civilian specialist shifted his weight, cleared his throat, then remained silent. He had learned when his expertise was welcome and when it was merely tolerated. This moment belonged to neither category. A telephone rang in a nearby office. One ring, then another. It was answered quickly. Voices dropped. A door closed. The sound of boots echoed on the stairs. Someone moving faster than before, but still not running. Papers rustled. A chair scraped back. In the communications room, a signal finally came through. It was brief, precise, entirely unremarkable in content. The operator wrote it down, then stared at the page longer than necessary. "Dewey forward?" he asked. The older operator glanced at the clock, then nodded. "Yes." The message was sent along its prescribed path, handed from room to room, each transfer conducted with the same calm professionalism that had defined the day. No one altered it. No one added emphasis. In the corridor, the man who had been waiting since morning checked his watch again. This time, he actually looked. His expression did not change, but his thumb pressed harder against the watch's casing before he snapped it shut. He took one step forward, then stopped. The door in front of him remained closed. In the map room, the senior officer finally set the pencil down. He straightened the envelope beside it, aligning its edge with the map's border. The lieutenant watched the movement closely, sensing, without understanding, that it mattered. For a brief moment, everything seemed poised. The men, the rooms, the town outside. The machinery of war had slowed to a near standstill, as if offering one last silent opportunity for interruption. No alarm sounded. No order was shouted. The window did not shatter. The telephone did not ring again. Time, compressed and stretched thin, held its shape for just a little longer, balanced on the edge of a choice no one fully realized they were about to stop making. It was not marked by a sound anyone could point to later. No siren, no raised voice, no sudden movement that forced attention. The building continued breathing at the same slow pace it had all day, and yet something within it shifted, subtle as a joint slipping out of place without pain. In the map room, the senior officer reached for the envelope again. He did not open it. He slid it a few inches to the side, clearing a space on the table where the map's edge had curled upward. With 2 fingers, he smoothed the paper flat. The gesture was small, practical. It looked like housekeeping. The lieutenant noticed that the envelope no longer touched the circled point. He did not mention it. The officer adjusted the brass weights at the corners of the map, nudging one closer to the pencil marks, anchoring them more firmly. The metal made a dull sound against the wood. It was barely audible, yet it settled something in the room. The officer sat back in his chair and exhaled through his nose, not in relief, but in acceptance of a posture that would not change again. In the communications room, the older operator reached up and rotated a dial a fraction to the left. It was the same adjustment he had made dozens of times before, a habitual response to interference. This time, he did not rotate it back. The younger operator saw the movement and hesitated. "Should we?" "It's fine," the older man said quietly. The signal that followed came through clearer, steadier. It filled the headphones with calm voices and measured words. The operator logged it, then passed the paper along without adding a comment. The gap he had noted earlier was closed. Not repaired, just bridged. In the corridor, the waiting man took another step forward. This time, no one stopped him. A clerk emerged from an office carrying a stack of forms and nearly collided with him. They both apologized at the same time. The clerk stepped aside and the man continued, stopping directly in front of the door he had been facing all day. He raised his hand, then lowered it again. The door opened from the inside. The room beyond was smaller than it had sounded. Two men sat at a table, their chairs angled toward each other. Papers lay arranged in neat stacks. A lamp cast a tight circle of light that did not reach the corners. The air smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. "You can wait," one of the men said, not unkindly. The waiting man nodded and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch settling into place echoed down the corridor and then vanished, absorbed by walls that had grown accustomed to closing things off. In the mess room, someone finished the last slice of bread and folded the empty cloth back over the plate. He did it slowly, smoothing the fabric as if presentation still mattered. No one reached for more. Outside, one of the idling vehicles shut off its engine. The sudden absence of sound drew a few glances from nearby drivers. Another engine started in its place, filling the gap. The rhythm resumed, altered but continuous. In the map room, the lieutenant shifted in his chair again. He finally opened the folder on his knees, more out of reflex than need. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a section he knew by heart. The text did not surprise him. What unsettled him was how familiar it felt now, how ordinary the language seemed after a day of quiet preparation. He closed the folder and placed it on the table. The civilian specialist turned from the window. "If the adjustment holds," he began, then stopped himself. He nodded once, as if concluding a thought that no longer required words. "Yes," the senior officer said. The word was final, not because it announced a decision, but because it acknowledged that something had already been set in motion. Down the hall, a telephone rang. This time it rang 3 times before being answered. The man who picked it up listened, then glanced toward the map room's closed door. He covered the receiver with his hand for a moment, weighing the interruption. He chose not to knock. "Understood," he said into the phone, his voice steady. He replaced the receiver and wrote a brief note. The note joined a growing stack on his desk, aligned carefully, edges squared. He did not mark it urgent. He did not need to. In the communications room, a message went out that mirrored one received earlier, its wording adjusted slightly for clarity. The change was minimal. One phrase replaced with another of equal length, but it altered the meaning just enough to close off an alternative that no one had discussed openly. The operator paused before sending it, finger hovering over the switch. He thought of asking for confirmation. He thought of the clock, the quiet rooms, the men waiting. He pressed the switch. The message left the building, traveling outward along wires and waves, slipping into a network already prepared to receive it. In the corridor, footsteps receded. Someone laughed softly, then stopped. A door opened and closed. The building's pulse remained steady. In the small room behind the door, the waiting man stood with his hands clasped behind his back, while the 2 seated men reviewed a document. One of them made a small correction in the margin, then initialed it. The ink glistened briefly before soaking into the paper. "That will be all," the man said. The waiting man nodded. He did not ask a question. He turned and left, the door closing behind him once more. This time, the latch sounded heavier. Back in the map room, the senior officer reached for his cap and placed it on the table beside him, brim facing down. He looked at the map one last time. not searching for errors, not reconsidering, simply looking. The lieutenant followed his gaze, trying to identify the exact moment when the room had changed. He could not. He only knew that the air felt different now, denser, less forgiving. Outside, the clouds lowered further, pressing the light into a uniform gray. The town seemed to withdraw into itself, shutters drawn, doors closed, conversations cut short. Inside the building, routines continued, but they had lost their flexibility. Each action followed the next without pause, without the small hesitations that had marked the earlier hours. No announcement was made. No signal was given that anyone would later recognize as the point of no return. Yet the space for stopping had closed, not slammed shut, not locked, simply passed through without ceremony. And the men inside the headquarters carried on, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of those who, without fully realizing it, had already stepped beyond the last place where turning back was still possible. The building grew quiet in a way that was not the absence of sound, but the removal of variation. Footsteps still moved through corridors. Paper still shifted. Lamps still hummed faintly as their filaments warmed. But everything happened at the same measured pace now, as if an invisible hand had set a single tempo and instructed the day to follow it without deviation. In the map room, no one spoke anymore. The senior officer remained seated, hands resting flat on the table, palms down as though steadying the surface beneath him. His eyes were fixed on the center of the map, not tracing lines, not measuring distances, just resting there, unblinking, like a man watching a horizon that refused to change. The lieutenant stood beside him, uncertain when he had risen from his chair. His folder lay unopened where he had placed it. He had stopped feeling the urge to check its contents. Whatever authority the pages once held had dissolved into the room itself. The civilian specialist gathered his things quietly. He stacked his pad, aligned the pencil, slipped both into his coat pocket. He did not ask whether he was needed further. He already understood the answer. Before leaving, he paused near the door, glanced back once, then went out without a sound. The door closed. It stayed closed. Down the hall, the communications room settled into a low, continuous murmur. Signals received, logged, acknowledged. The operators spoke less now. Their movements had become economical, practiced, free of hesitation. Headphones were adjusted, switches were flipped, paper slid from one place to another with care. A message arrived. It was complete. It was unremarkable. It fit perfectly into the sequence that had already formed. The operator wrote it down, tore the sheet cleanly from the pad, and passed it along. No one commented on it. There was nothing left to say. In the corridor, the man who had waited all morning stood by a window, looking out through the wire mesh at the street below. The vehicles were still there. Some engines were off now. Others idled, their vibrations faint but persistent. Drivers remained in their seats, hands on wheels, eyes forward. The man did not check his watch again. He had stopped counting minutes. Time at this point was no longer something to be measured. It had become a condition. A clerk passed him carrying a ledger. Their shoulders brushed lightly. Neither apologized. The contact registered and then vanished, absorbed by the building's larger stillness. Downstairs, the messroom lights were dimmed. The cook wiped his hands on his apron and hung it on a hook. He stood for a moment, listening. When nothing changed, he turned off the remaining lamp and left the room in shadow. Outside, the town seemed to hold itself together through habit alone. Curtains were drawn, doors remained shut. Somewhere, a radio played softly behind a wall, the music thin and distorted, fading in and out, as if unsure it was welcome. Back upstairs, the telephone rang once. It did not ring again. No one reached for it. In the map room, the senior officer finally moved. He lifted his hands from the table and folded them together, fingers interlaced. The simple act carried a sense of completion, like the closing of a book that would not be reopened. The lieutenant noticed the movement and inhaled sharply, then forced himself to exhale slowly. He felt the strange urge to speak, to ask something, anything, but the words never formed. Questions belonged to an earlier version of the day. From the far end of the corridor came the sound of a door being locked. The key turned deliberately, metal scraping against metal, then stopped. The sound echoed briefly and then disappeared. The building's lights flickered once, just enough to draw attention, then stabilized. No one reacted. Flickers had happened before. This one meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. In the communications room, the older operator removed his headphones and set them carefully on the desk, aligning them beside the logbook. He rubbed his hands together once, as if warming them, then rested them on his knees. The younger operator glanced at him surprised, then followed suit. They waited. In the corridor, air seemed to thicken. The faint smell of oil and paper and damp wool blended into something heavier, harder to breathe through. Men adjusted their collars. Someone swallowed. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Loud enough now to be noticed, too slow to be useful. Outside, a single engine shut down. Another followed. The street fell into a near silence broken only by the wind moving along the building's facade. In the map room, the senior officer closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not in prayer, not in regret, but as if committing the room to memory. When he opened them again, his gaze returned to the same fixed point. No one entered. No one left. The systems continued running because they had been told to do so long ago, and no instruction had arrived to make them stop. Somewhere beyond the walls, forces already in motion adjusted their course by fractions too small to feel, guided by messages that had been sent and received and accepted without resistance. Inside, the men waited, not for impact, not for confirmation, but for the continuation of a process that no longer required their attention. Breath moved in and out of lungs. Lamps burned steadily. Paper lay flat beneath weights. Time did not announce itself. It simply narrowed. And in that narrowing, between 1 second and the next, the world paused, perfectly balanced, suspended at the exact moment before everything that could still remain unchanged finally slipped out of reach. Nothing moved at first. Or rather, everything moved so little that motion became impossible to distinguish from stillness. The building seemed to settle into itself, as if its weight had finally been distributed evenly. Walls no longer creaked, pipes no longer complained. Even the faint electrical hum that had threaded through the day softened, blending into the background until it felt less like a sound and more like pressure in the ears. In the map room, the air was dense enough to feel. The senior officer remained seated, posture unchanged, hands still interlaced. His breathing was shallow and even, controlled to the point of near invisibility. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the slight rise and fall of his chest, but no one was watching him now. Attention had drifted inward, toward the quiet accumulation of seconds. The lieutenant stood beside the table, eyes unfocused. He was no longer looking at the map, or the markings, or the weights holding the paper flat. His gaze rested somewhere just beyond them, as if the room itself had become too small to contain what was coming. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He did not speak. He understood, without fully articulating it, that speaking belonged to an earlier phase of the day. Down the corridor, men remained where they were. No one leaned anymore. No one paced. They stood or sat in positions that required the least adjustment, conserving movement, conserving presence. A hand rested on a windowsill. Another held the back of a chair. Fingers curled loosely, ready to tighten if necessary, though no one could have said why. In the communications room, the operators waited with their equipment live, but untouched. Headphones lay on desks. Switches remained in their last positions. Logs were up to date. There was nothing left to correct. The room had reached a state of completion, as though its purpose for the day had already been fulfilled. A faint signal passed through the system, registered, acknowledged automatically without comment. It joined the others seamlessly, indistinguishable from the flow that preceded it. No one marked the time. The telephone in the side office remained silent. Its receiver rested perfectly in place, cord coiled without tension. Dust had begun to settle on the surface around it, already reclaiming the object as something static, archival. Outside, the town held its breath. The vehicles that had idled for hours were now mostly still. Engines were off. Metal cooled, ticking softly as it contracted. Drivers remained in their seats, some with hands folded, others resting their foreheads briefly against steering wheels. Eyes closed, not in sleep but in suspension. Windows across the street reflected nothing but gray. The clouds above pressed low in uniform, erasing depth and distance. There was no horizon anymore, just a continuous ceiling that seemed to lower by imperceptible degrees. Back inside, a clock ticked. The sound was clear now, isolated. Each tick landed with deliberate weight, carving the space between moments into narrow, defined segments. No one checked it. No one counted. The sound existed on its own terms. In the map room, the senior officer shifted one finger slightly against another. The movement was involuntary, almost unconscious. It stopped as quickly as it began. His hands returned to stillness. The lieutenant inhaled slowly, then held the breath for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before letting it out. The release was silent. It changed nothing. In the corridor, a door creaked faintly as the building adjusted to temperature. The sound traveled, thin and fragile, then vanished. No footsteps followed, no voices answered it. The systems continued running because stopping them would require a command, and no command was coming. Somewhere far beyond the walls, trajectories aligned, distances closed, timelines overlapped in ways no one inside could see or feel anymore. The machinery of consequence moved forward not with speed, but with inevitability. Inside the headquarters, the final moments stretched, not dramatically, not urgently, but with the quiet precision of something reaching its natural limit. Breaths were taken and released. Lamps held their glow. Paper did not shift. Nothing had happened. Nothing needed to happen yet. And in that fragile space, where action was no longer possible, but impact had not yet arrived, time stopped advancing in any way that mattered, freezing the world in the last thin instant when everything was still exactly as it had been, even though it never would be again.